So, let's have some fun. Today, I want to talk about the challenges of delivering a really rich user experience. And by that, I mean something that is chocker full of content. And how do we do that while keeping it fast and engaging from the very first moment? I've got 3 case studies that we'll review. And while we're looking at these, even though we're looking at some techniques, what I really want you to focus on is actually the overall process and the team dynamics behind these projects. And as Steve kind of said, like a lot of this is actually about communication. And I think Steve's even been trying to coin this new D for P, design and performance kind of crossover thing. So I think it's an interesting kind of area to explore. So keep that in the back of your mind. And let's see if we can answer this question about how we make something very rich, but also make it very fast. Now, too often when we talk about performance and optimizing the user experience, we hear people talking about what should be removed. Make less requests, concatenate and minify all the things, remove everything you can off the page. I blame Steve for a lot of this and the Sauder's 14 kind of rules of performance. I worry that this can lead to a real culture of reductionism, where the inevitable conclusion is that the fastest page is a page with nothing on it. Now, I love minimalism, and I also love the recent move that we've had in digital aesthetics to flat design, and we've seen everyone adopt this over the last few years. But it does get boring after a while. I have to confess that I miss the bad old days of Flash-based websites. You can boo me, you can throw stones, but there was a free-form richness that Flash allowed, and a way of building a user experience that was very unbound by layout issues, and it was inherently time-based. From the very first moment, you were working with X and Y and Z positioning and thinking in frames per second and timelines. You always asked yourself, how do I play this experience? I'm also very happy to admit that this free-form nature led to some of the most atrocious websites we've ever seen. But I would argue also some of the most innovative. And while I'm really happy to see Flash as a technology disappear and wholeheartedly believe in an open web, I do think that we have to be very careful to not lose some of the great thinking and the great techniques, not these ones, that were developed in Flash-based websites. So we have HTML5, we have Canvas, we have OpenGL. They're all kind of fantastic and great, but I would argue that it's largely been a 5-year sidestep as we've moved to these new technologies, and we've now had to rediscover all the same techniques that we were using in Flash many, many years ago. And now we also have to deal with the inconsistencies of various browsers. Love it or hate it, one of the marvelous things about Flash was the fact that it had an over 98% adoption rate. And it was a very consistent runtime, so that when something worked, it just worked everywhere. That gave developers a lot of extra time and permission to invest in better techniques. And so it's only just recently that I would argue that we're seeing a sort of a rediscovery of how important time-based thinking is in creating rich and fast user experiences. So how do we balance the desire for a very rich user experience full of content with the need to deliver it in the short attention span of our users? We know from research, and you see a lot of it here at Velocity, that users get bored and lose interest in after only a few seconds. And they even expect content within 1 second. And that's on mobile too. You know, how many of you guys are delivering websites in under a second? So let's dig into our first case study. And this is an interactive music video for the band Shihad. I'll play a quick demo and then we can dig into some of the techniques behind it. So this project was a heap of fun. We got to blast rock fans with air and water cannons and captured their reactions at 10,000 frames per second. The delightful thing about this experience is how interactive it feels. You're watching a video and you can zoom in and out of any of the people that you see here on the grid. We achieve this by simultaneously streaming two videos. One is the grid underneath that also has the audio track in it, and then you can pop open an extra video stream on top. The response time is really snappy, and the video stream over the top starts playing in sync almost immediately. Now, I don't know about you, I mean, I live in New Zealand, I'm on a horrible ADSL connection. Sometimes even just streaming a single piece of video can be a real challenge and lead to lots of buffering. So, how did we get two simultaneous streams working together so well? The key here was to sit down with the entire team at the beginning of the project and brainstorm those bandwidth challenges as part of the creative brief with the actual music video director. This led to really specific choices about using black and white as an aesthetic and high contrast as an aesthetic, and also leaving this video in super slow motion. Those really deliberate choices about the colour space and also the slow movement meant that we could compress these video streams at a much higher compression ratio. This let us deliver two streams of video in the bandwidth that you'd normally need for just one video. And what I love about this project is how the performance constraints actually became part of the creative brief and directly led to aesthetic choices. And so it's only through this really integrated collaboration across the entire process that we were able to deliver such an engaging user experience. So, next case study. Let's bring on the bugs.
Hello, and welcome to Kitchen. I'm Erky, he's Perky, and this is Kitchen. Take a look around. It's no hot dog stand, but you can still find some crumbs. Once you collect some for me, I'll let you join our secret club.
Yeah, but don't let Mad Margaret find out. The secret club.
That reminds me of a long time ago when two young bugs first...
So the challenge with Erky Perky was to create a very rich and interactive environment for kids who were the fan of this cartoon show based in Australia. We had access to the same voiceover artists and animators from the show, so we were able to script and dream up anything we wanted the characters to do. The desire to stream a large high-resolution interactive scene like this with lots of animation was a real technical challenge. We explored a number of different approaches, including embedding small videos, but the delay as the video started, and you quite often get a gamma shift between images and video when you encode using H.264, meant that it destroyed the illusion of this big, large interactive scene where you can click and interact with any of the characters. So We then moved to start to work with PNG sequences, but the compressed output was still far too big and slow. So while exploring this, I stumbled across an undocumented scripting feature in Flash that allowed you to script the creation of a timeline sequence and, while importing the frames, position them wherever you wanted using scripting. At the same time, I was also doing a lot of reading into the inner workings of various video codecs. And so I started to explore some of those basic ideas from video codecs and see if I could apply them to my PNG sequence. And so I took the idea of interframe temporal compression, which is where you only store the differences in movement between each frame. And I ended up building and recreating a simple version of this for our PNG sequences. The key was to analyse the changing pixels between each frame and use that information to then trim down each frame to just the bounding box of the movement. So if we look at this character here, Fresnel, we can see pretty much the whole body is moving. And then we used ImageMagick to do a simple visual diff on that movement. And there was really nice things in ImageMagick as well, where you can set a fuzz factor. So we're also able to trim off really small kind of movements and just focus in on the large movements that our characters were making. And so using that visual diff, we can then trim off the edge pixels around these changing frames. And you can see in this particular example, because Fresnel, his whole body is moving, that there's only a certain amount we can trim off. Where this technique really came into its own is when we started talking to the animators, and we asked them to change their animation style. Normally, when they were animating for the TV show, they would be keeping the whole character alive all the time because that creates, good engagement on TV and you've got unlimited kind of bandwidth. But what we asked them to do when they were animating these characters was to move more, pose to pose, and in between those poses, actually hold the action while the character was talking. And so that kept the character and the body locked off while just a small bit of movement like a voice or like lips or kind of a hand was moving. And the resulting animation still looked really great, but it made a huge difference when it came to compression. So in this example, we can see that Fresnel is more locked off while he's talking directly to camera, and only his mouth and hand are moving a little bit. So now when we did our visual diff and we added a bit of fuzz factor in, we can see that there's only a smaller amount of pixels moving. And this meant that we could trim off a huge amount of the pixels for this particular frame. And so working with the animators to animate in a compression sympathetic style and applying our homemade interframe kind of visual diffing, we were able to more than halve the size of our PNG sequence. And that meant that we could have way more animation, way more characters in each scene, and stream in each character independently and create this really rich experience for these kids. So having a team that collaborated right across the content pipeline, right from the character voiceovers and the initial scripting and storyboarding of each scene through the animation and the compression, is what kept this project feeling really fast because it started quickly, but then also very rich. And it kept these characters alive and really nimble on their feet. Now, forgive me, I'm going to take a moment to show off here a little bit. But I think this project is kind of worth it. I think this project really pushed the boundaries of web design, and to be honest, it's one of the absolute highlights of my 20-year career. Tourism New Zealand gave me an absolutely remarkable opportunity to take the investment and the budget that they would normally make in a really large international brand TV commercial, and instead challenged me to apply those same high production values to a digital concept, and a digital concept which would help tourists immerse themselves in potentially what a New Zealand experience felt like and looked like to draw them to New Zealand. So I've got a short behind the scenes video here, and then we'll dig into the techniques afterwards. It also shows off a little bit of wonderful New Zealand. The concept is basically to scroll us through a beautiful set of scenes. What we're doing is actually building 4 huge virtual scroll bars around the country. This is our first street here, so we're scrolling down Waiheke. We move through from a wide vista of Auckland through into a nice restaurant scene.
With this camera on this drop every 15 seconds. So we're not running the camera the whole time, it's in time lapse.
Now taken what was quite a simple idea of what does it feel like to scroll the camera down the page and turned it into something amazingly real. So it's amazing to be on location and see these 4 different scaff towers that we've built on this giant scroll bar. Now, part of the reason I showed that is like people didn't actually believe for a while that we actually went out and did this. And so we ended up doing more scenes than this around the country, and I don't expect I'll ever be able to build a homepage like this again. But so it was amazing. We got to take these incredible time-lapse sequences and connect them really simply to the scroll bar, letting the user control the camera and literally scroll through some of New Zealand's most amazing vistas. The interaction model is super simple, but the act of controlling the camera is really unexpected. It totally sucks you into each scene and you play with it, discovering the changing action and interacting with this content again and again. Now, some people really heavily criticise this project for delivering a homepage that was over 23 megabytes in size. That's do you know what the outliers are in the HTTP archive, Steve?
There's nothing over 22.
But I think people were just a little bit jealous. Size does count. In fact, we went to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the experience was smooth and immediately engaging. In fact, my brief to the developers, and they went pale when I said this, was that we had to have absolutely no loading bars, and that the initial content had to render as quickly as possible, even faster than a normal page. So How do we do that? So what you're looking at now is a really exaggerated example of how the experience loads on a super slow connection. This is kind of modem speed. The trick we settled on after dozens of prototypes was to use a series of sprite sheets. We then used Canvas to chop a frame out of that sprite sheet and scale it up to fill the viewport size. Doing this made the image feel really blurry, but it made it feel like a blurry progressive JPEG, right? And we know what that feels like on the web. It's a familiar mental model to see a JPEG first blurry and then get sharper and sharper. So by using that same mental model as a progressive JPEG, we didn't even have to explain to a user what was going on. The user gets to immediately scroll up and down through the page and they see all the frames. Then when they pause, the high quality images snap in over the top. And as soon as there's any extra bandwidth, it loads extra sprite sheets and then loads extra frames on either side. And so what you're also seeing here is a visual sort of debugging kind of bar that a lot of the projects that we do, we always try and have visual feedback for what is actually happening in the code base. And I think a little bit as we saw in Doug's talk in the last session, having that capture and having that visualization of what's actually happening in the network is a really important way to reflect on your code base and make sure that what's actually going through the pipe is the same as the concept that you think is going into the pipe. And so when you watch the loading debug kind of tool on the top left there, you see the 3 levels of sprite sheets. And then the last level is all the high resolution frames. And as you watch it, you'll see that it strategically loads the different sprite sheets. The sprite sheets are split into different chunks as well. And then when the scroll bar, when you pause, you see the frames walk out in either direction. So these sorts of visual feedback tools are really invaluable when you're doing prototyping and really trying to understand what's happening in the code. So here we see that first sprite sheet, and in fact all of the over 200 frames fitted it into a single 34K image. So when you first loaded this page, it was actually under 100K for all the JavaScript and this first kind of sprite sheet. And all the HTML is nice and crisp over the top. So even though the page was 23 megabytes, if you sat there and let the whole thing load, in under 100K, which is probably well under the average these days, you already had the initial experience. And so right from that very first moment, you knew what the interaction model was, and you knew how to interact with the page. There was content, that content engaged you and held you while the rest streamed in behind the scenes. Here's the next kind of level of sprite sheet. We had 2 of these. And then the third level, there's kind of 8. So it depends how quickly you scroll around the experience. If you just scroll right to the bottom, then we only load those particular sprite sheets. And then we had our high quality frames, which this is a number of years ago now. So these were only like 1280. You'd go even higher now for Retina. So this would probably be more like a 100 megabyte homepage if you did it these days. And so now let's sort of come back to what some of the underlying principles behind these 3 projects are. You know, what's common in terms of the dynamic here in the process. And I think the interesting thing is the emphasis on process throughout all 3. They all had really highly collaborative teams across the entire process from concept to delivery. And I'm a huge believer in having that collaboration. If you have separate teams, and those separate teams are just looking after their specialization, marketing, design, front end, back end, ops, if you have all those in silos, then that's never going to work. You're never going to get any of these sorts of solutions would have all failed if it didn't have that collaboration right across from development to creative concept right at the very beginning. You can't just throw an idea over the fence from team to team and hope that the results are going to be fast and rich. And in fact, when you think about fast and rich, they're actually opposing interests in a project. Without collaboration, one always suffers. It's either rich and slow as hell, or it's really fast and really boring. So now that we've got those collaborating teams, they need to agree on what is it that they're trying to deliver. And that's where you must have a strong set of guiding principles throughout the project. It's absolutely vital. You need to also do the user research. You need those UX researchers out there actually understanding what is it that you're trying to deliver. They need to understand users, and they need to understand what those users are actually trying to achieve, because that affects how long they're prepared to wait. And if you can't meet your users' expectations, then your projects are always going to struggle. There's always going to be a disconnect. Also, these three projects all worked within the constraints of the web. The design teams weren't pretending that everyone was on a high-speed fibre connection and on the latest MacBook kind of Pro. In fact, the limitations of the web and the nature of the web was actually kind of built into these concepts. And the need to manage the flow of content in the browser actually became part of the concept and the content itself. Embrace latency. So, like any good craftsperson, you must know your tools and know your materials. And I always challenge designers to work in code. In fact, in my last role as a creative director, I banned Photoshop completely. Designers had to work in code alongside front-end people from the very first moment. And I do this because it's vital to know how the web actually works. So you must spend time understanding the mechanics of the web. You must embrace latency. You need to embrace TCP slow start. You need to embrace the critical rendering path in the browser and understand how you're blocking those first pixels from showing. And as we've seen today, you need to embrace those slow 2G connections in developing countries and build these sorts of constraints into your creative and development processes. We all know that out of those constraints and boundaries, those are the things that really unlock creativity. So for the next part of this talk, I really want to focus on the thinking required to deliver a fast and rich user experience. I believe the mental model we need to put at the heart of our creative and development processes is a real renewed focus on how content flows in and out of the user experience. Now, it still feels like our mental model of how the web works is stuck in the metaphor of the library. Websites are sort of like books, and they're full of pages that we link together with hyperlinks. The danger in this metaphor is that it also sets a very high bandwidth expectation. If only we had this sort of bandwidth. If only I could grab a website off the shelf like I can a beautiful book and instantly flick through it and access all that information in thousands of high-res images without any kind of latency or load time at all. That's just not the web. In fact, the web is so much more than a library. It's a mixture of all sorts of technologies and metaphors that make it a very exciting medium to work in. Our language and the mental model of the web has not moved on, though. And we still talk about pages, and we move from site to site like they are books with a physical location. I believe this type of language really constrains our thinking, and it needs to be challenged. In fact, I believe that we should be viewing the web primarily as a time-based medium, rather than one of static publishing. So why aren't we doing this? And again, it's my fault. So I blame the design process for a lot of this. Far too often when we create wireframes and we create mock-ups, they're presented in the final state rather than as a time-based experience. And you see this when you walk into any design studio. There's full, beautifully rendered mock-ups sitting on the wall, or even worse still, put in context like this, as if they just magically appeared in front of the user. Mock-ups like this are just present one moment in time, and it's often just that last frame of the user experience. What happened on the way to the page looking like this? It sets an expectation within the organisation, within marketing teams, that there was never any load time. And then you get a frustrated CEO going, but the mock-up was like beautiful and perfect, like you're setting this incredibly high expectation. And then when they see the reality, there's a huge disconnect there in the mental model. So we need to stop talking about pages. You're not making a book. And in fact, we should instead be visualizing our designs using the techniques and language of film. A storyboard or a film strip where each frame is considered and the story is told over time is a much better tool for visualizing our content and how that content will flow into the browser. Now, the language you use is vitally important. And if we are to change our mental model and move from static publishing to a time-based mental model, we need to change the language we use. Now, I know it's late in the conference, but if there's one thing you kind of take away with you, and I hope you do this when you go back to your teams on Monday, is I'd like you to sit down the next time you're in a design or a development kind of session and ask the people around you questions like this. How will this experience flow over time? You know, imagine yourself looking at that mock-up on the wall that the designer's just put in front of you. How's this going to work? What happens first? Like, what element comes onto the page first? Then what happens? And then, you know, what keep going each step. What does each moment look like as it loads over time? And how does it play? So I believe that asking these types of questions and changing our language will help refocus the team on a time-based mental model and examine what the experience feels like as it actually loads. What happens from the very first moment you click is just as important as what the final loaded experience looks like. The journey of the page loading needs to be just as delightful as the final result. Otherwise, people will abandon your experience and never get to your awesome content. We need to craft and care about every millisecond in the same way that a designer cares about every pixel on screen. We just don't do that at the moment. And so we can use great tools like web page tests that capture these film strips at 60 frames per second to reflect that user experience over time. And we can use these film strips because they're visual and they're simple and they don't require any interpretation except our eyes. And we can use them across the organisation. I've had huge amounts of success by putting film strips like this in front of CEOs and marketing people and designers, and you don't even have to say anything. You just put up the slide and you stand back. And this might be competitor 1, 2, 3. And then it only takes a few moments and the CEO will lean over and go, "What's all that blank white space? Why does it take so long before I can see our content?" "Oh, you know, there's a critical rendering path and there's like tag managers, and Adobe said we could do it async, but then they don't support it, so it's actually blocking, and then we filled it full of like tags." You know, it's kind of, there's a million and one excuses, but all that kind of melts away when people are confronted with the simple visual experience. So we need to move back to the sort of thinking that was in Flash. Flash was always timeline based. It was never a page. And that really changed the approach and the thought that you brought into a project. Every frame had to be crafted and thought about as you went through that experience. Now, I'm not really saying Flash, but you know. And so we need to be thinking about and communicating in timelines, not pages. We need to remember that every click of the mouse is like clicking a play button, and that it triggers a flow of content that unfolds in front of the user. And a lot of the film strips that we see in presentations around velocity, you see pages that take 10 seconds to load, 15 seconds to load. Think about a TV commercial. Think about the ads that you see in YouTube. A lot of them are like less than 15 seconds. Some of them are only 5 seconds. Think about the stories that are played out in that 5 seconds. That's a huge amount of time that we're asking people to wait. And we're not giving them anything except a blank screen. And we're all conditioned through that advertising, through the rich nature of a time-based medium, to expect a lot more engagement and story than that. So we need to treat our medium in the same way. We're clicking those play buttons. We're playing it in front of our eyeballs. And these sequences are not about hiding the fact that we're loading content. We can even use the transitions to add narrative and context. And we're now seeing this sort of time-based thinking being reinforced in design systems like Google's material design, where there's a real emphasis on meaningful transitions. Motion design can be an effective guide for the user's attention, and it can inform them and delight them. We can use motion to smoothly transport users between navigational contexts. We can explain changes in the arrangement of elements on the screen and reinforce the various hierarchies in the page. We're also seeing people like Facebook and Pinterest really champion the use of skeleton screens and give the user visual feedback as quickly as possible that they are on the right website and that content is on its way. So thinking about every single frame. Now, a skeleton screen is really about perceived performance. And Steve has done a great talk on perceived performance and the sort of tricks that you can use visually to let people know that content is coming. And I really recommend you check that out. And that perceived performance is really about getting those first few frames of the content flow in front of people as quickly as possible. So here I've got an example where I've taken the Nickelodeon website and I've done a quick and dirty skeleton on this. Now, I only spent an hour on this, so it's pretty kind of rough. But when you look at the skeleton, you know you're on the Nickelodeon website. There's that familiar orange. I can see the brand in the corner. I can see a bit of navigation. And I've taken, the arrangement of the page. There's these objects that are going to load. And I've mapped that out with a bit of CSS. A little bit like Pinterest, I've found like the median kind of color for each of those images, and I've used that to help sort of color the page as well. Now, this page is one request. And I kind of cheated here. I just took a screenshot of the Nickelodeon website for that corner, and then I just base64 encoded it and inlined it in the page. And I used an inline CSS styling to do the rest of it. So one request, and it's under 9 kilobytes. Now, I've also got a rule here about keeping it under 14K. If you've seen Ilya Gogorik's great talk about how to render to screen in under 1 second, this is where this comes from. On mobile, you've got one request that you can make, and because of the TCP slow start, it has to be under 14K. But from my perspective, 14K is a huge amount of room to establish brand, to establish a skeleton, to start to engage someone. And the result of this is hugely dramatic. I didn't even believe this when I did it last night. But so the Nickelodeon website, and this is not even the full page. The full page is actually more like 30 seconds, but I just cut it off here at 8, which is when it's getting to a similar state. I've got the orange, I've got a few images. They haven't even all loaded, but I know I'm on the Nickelodeon website. And so if we do that with our skeleton, with our one request, that was actually at 0.4 of a second. And WebPageTest just rounded that off to show me the half a second frame. So this is a huge dramatic difference in terms of what you're asking me to do and engage in. So I'd really encourage you to use techniques like this, and I think they really help us create a more time-based experience. They let us really focus in on the flow of content in and out of the browser as we move through time. Doing so lets us hold the attention of that user. It feels faster, and so that gives us permission and it buys us more time to then really deliver that rich experience that we're after. So my belief is that by switching to more of a time-based model and focusing on content flow, that is how we deliver a really fast and a very rich user experience. And so remember, folks, that what we're really doing here is making movies, not pages.
That's all, folks.
Thank you.